In opening this presentation titled Sobukwe and Pan Africanism, allow me to quote a man who was clearly ahead of his time, a Pan-Africanist to the core. Mangalasu Sobukwe defiantly declared war on Africa's biggest enemy, white supremacy, when he said, open quote, "Let it be clear that we are not fighting just apartheid. We are fighting the whole concept of white supremacy, and we are fully aware of the nature and size of our task, and we will not shirk it." Close quote. Greetings all from occupied Azania, still called with its colonial name, South Africa. Let me make it clear right from the start that I'm simply repeating what is already known and being deliberately erased by the powers that be through miseducation and other means. Perhaps let me begin with identifying the problem of Africa. Africa's problem began with colonialism, and perhaps that problem needs to be defined. The simplest definition of colonialism is that it is the act of one nation controlling another for economic gain. It is the policy of a country seeking to extend or retain its authority over other people or territories, generally with the aim of economic dominance. It is a process in which colonizers impose their religion, economics, and cultural practices on indigenous people. Summarized, therefore, colonialism is the building, establishment and maintaining of colonies in one territory by people from another territory. Sovereignty over that colony is claimed by the colonizing power. When we talk of colonialism, we refer to a period of history dating from the 15th to the 20th century, when people from Europe built colonies on other continents, Africa in particular. This takeover in its nature is violent. Colonialists took African land through the gun, and not without resistance from African warriors. Africans fought numerous battles against land dispossession for more than 200 years, until 1913, when African land was completely seized by colonialists and its riches used for the sole benefit of the colonial settlers. As I mentioned earlier on, colonialism was driven by economics, religion, and militarism, and has four common characteristics, which are political and legal domination by colonizers over the colonized, relations of economics and political dependence, exploitation of the economy by the imperial power, racial and cultural inequality. There are two types, for lack of a better word, of colonialism, namely settler colonialism, which involves a large number of colonists that settle in a country, seeking fertile land to farm. And the second type is exploitation colonialism, where there are fewer colonists typically interested in extracting resources to export to the metropole. The balkanization or partitioning of Africa by the Berlin Conference, called by General Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, whose sole purpose was for European countries to claim colonial land in Africa and to avoid a war amongst themselves over African territory. It is at this conference where the rules were made for European colonization. The goal of the Berlin Conference of 1885 was to partition Africa, and the reason to colonize to Africa were economic, political, and religious. The Berlin Conference was perhaps significant due to the major role it had in the colonization of Africa. It gave European nations an opportunity to take control of Africa and disregard Africans. In 1884, the Berlin Conference was convened to discuss African colonization with the aim of setting up international guidelines for making claims to African land, and where there were no political leaders, nor delegates, nor ambassadors from Africa at this conference. As I mentioned earlier on, the main objective of that conference was to codify and legalize the European colonization of Africa. The Berlin Conference formally regulated European colonial efforts in the scramble for Africa and basically overrode the autonomy and self-governance of African people. The policies established at the Berlin Conference continue to have a negative impact on Africa today. When the conference opened on the 15th of November 1884, 14 countries, Austria, Hungary, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Netherlands, Portugal, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Norway, Turkey, and the USA were represented by a plethora of ambassadors and envoys. Its outcomes, the General Act of the Berlin Conference, formalized the scramble for Africa. The diplomats in Berlin laid the rules of competition by which the great powers were to be guided in seeking colonies. No nation was to stake claims in Africa without notifying the other powers of its intentions. The most significant impact of the Berlin Conference had on Africa was the creation of colonial empires that fragmented the entire continent, with the exception of Ethiopia, which remained independent.